Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving into an absolutely incredible historical mystery, and it's all about the true scale of India's ancient and pre-colonial education system. We're going to go on a really fascinating journey here, going all the way from the massive, globally renowned universities of the ancient world right up to the humble village schools of the 19th century.
So let me ask you something right off the bat. Was India actually uneducated before the 19th century? You know, it's a super common historical assumption that widespread education is this strictly modern Western export. But the source material we're digging into today tells a vastly different story. And honestly, it completely challenges what a lot of us think we know about history.
100,000. Yep, you heard that right. According to official British surveys from the 1830s, specifically the ones done by a missionary named William Adam, this was the estimated number of village schools in Bengal and Bihar alone. Think about that for a second. To put that into perspective, it works out to roughly one school for every 400 people. Just incredible density.
Okay, moving to Section 1. A school in every village.
When British administrators actually went out and surveyed the land, they were absolutely floored to find that almost every village, big or small, had at least one school. And what's really surprising is the admission from William Adam himself. After his deep surveys, he actually compared these humble Indian village schools to his own education back home. He flat out noted that the practical skills taught in Bengal had a more direct bearing on daily life than what he learned in Scotland. The kids were out there learning reading, writing, and real-world agricultural and commercial accounts.
Now, you might be wondering, how did they pull this off economically? Well, they used a highly efficient monitorial system. Instead of relying entirely on adults, the older, more advanced scholars actually taught the younger ones. It was like a giant self-sustaining puzzle. And this method was so brilliantly simple that a guy named Dr. Andrew Bell actually borrowed it and introduced it into England. Plus, these schools were deeply tied to the local economy. They were funded right out of local village revenue or by teachers who worked without even expecting a paycheck. Contrast that with the British system that eventually replaced it, a top-down, super expensive model that needed heavily salaried teachers and brand new buildings.
Which brings us to Section 2, the ancient global universities.
To really get how this widespread culture of learning took root, we got to flash back to the ancient world. Way before Oxford or Cambridge were even a thought, India was home to these massive global hubs like Takshashila and Nalanda. And they weren't just teaching theology. We're talking strictly multidisciplinary stuff here. Students dove into logic, astronomy, math, and really complex medicine. In fact, historical records mention an ancient physician named Jivaka, who was tied to Takshashila, actually performing complex cranial and intestinal surgeries. No way, right?
The global prestige of these places was just off the charts. Like when the famous Chinese scholar Huansong visited the region in the 7th century, he ran into some monks from Ceylon. He asked them, "Hey, should I travel there to further my studies?" And they gave him this wonderfully blunt answer: "There are no brilliant minds outside Nalanda." It was literally the ultimate academic draw of the ancient world.
And here's the really wild part about how these ancient mega campuses functioned financially. Much like those later village schools we talked about, they relied entirely on local support. Over 100 surrounding villages took it upon themselves to completely fund the teachers and the 8,500 students at Nalanda. This created this beautiful self-sustaining ecosystem where education was 100% free. It meant scholars could focus purely on learning without worrying about how to pay for it.
Let's move on to Section 3, who was actually studying.
All right, jumping back to the 19th century. We've seen the massive scale, but who exactly was sitting at these desks? Now, for a long time, there's been this popular assumption that historical education in India was strictly for the elite castes. But look at the data from the 1822 Madras Presidency Survey. It completely flips that narrative. In Tamil-speaking areas, a massive 70 to 84% of the students in these indigenous schools were from the Sudras and other castes. The Brahmin, or twice-born students, only made up about 16 to 30%. So this widespread network was actually remarkably inclusive for its time.
And what about the girls? Well, while a lot of girls were homeschooled, the data shows some really surprising regional variations. Down in Malabar, up to 30% of the students attending schools were girls. This actually ties perfectly back to an ancient Indian tradition of female scholars known as Brahmavadinis, women who were right there actively participating in high-level philosophical debates.
Section 4. Uprooting the beautiful tree. So how did this all fall apart? Let's map out the key destructive events, because it's basically a two-part tragedy. First came the physical destruction. In 455 CE, the Huns overran Taxashila. Then later, in the 12th century, invaders like Khilji destroyed Nalanda, literally burning its massive libraries to the ground. The scholars fled, and the ancient university system collapsed. But the localized village schools? They actually survived, at least until a structural collapse in the 19th century under British rule. This was sparked by policy shifts like the 1835 Macaulay Memo, which slowly bled the system dry, eventually leading to widespread illiteracy by the 1850s.
Now, before that structural collapse, there was this massive policy tug-of-war. On one side, you had the Orientalists who wanted to preserve vernacular learning and build up the indigenous system that was already there. But on the other side were the Anglicists, led by figures like Thomas Macaulay, and they ultimately won out. They instituted an English-only focus, aimed at creating a small elite class to act as interpreters, and in doing so they shifted all state support completely away from indigenous languages, native sciences, and those local village schools.
But honestly, what really starved those indigenous schools wasn't just policy. It was the economics. The British administration resumed rent-free lands that had traditionally supported the teachers. Then, heavy new taxation meant villages just couldn't afford to self-fund their local schools anymore. Combine that with the shift of capital heading off to Europe and the decline of local manufacturing, and these local communities were left totally impoverished. Within just a few decades, that once thriving network of 100,000 schools just withered away.
All right, let's bring it back to today with Section 5, the modern Nalanda revival.
So, the really cool news is that Nalanda University has actually been re-established today in Bihar as an international research university. But while both the ancient and modern versions attract students from all over the world and focus heavily on multidisciplinary research, there are some pretty big differences. Ancient Nalanda was this free monastic institution totally centered around Buddhist theology and intense rituals. Modern Nalanda, well, it charges tuition, uses secular hostels, and focuses on modern academic stuff like ecology and international relations alongside the history.
The admissions process has totally evolved too. Today, it follows a pretty standard 4-step modern process. Get a bachelor's degree, prove your English proficiency, write a statement of purpose, and nail an interview. That is quite a contrast to the ancient Mahavihara. Back then, prospective students literally faced off in these incredibly tough verbal debates at the front gates just to get inside, and only about 20% even passed.
This whole historical roller coaster really boils down to this one famous thought from Mahatma Gandhi in 1931. Speaking in London, he made the point that the British administrators didn't build upon the existing indigenous education system. Instead, he said, they scratched the soil, left the root exposed, and the beautiful tree perished.
And that brings us to our final takeaway. We've seen the absolute sheer scale, the surprising inclusivity, and the brilliance of India's historical education ecosystem. And we've seen how easily it was unraveled by simple shifts in policy and economics. So here's what I want to leave you with. How can our modern education systems learn from these lost, holistic models of the past? Can we somehow reclaim that deeply localized, highly practical, and universally accessible spirit of learning today? It's a lot to think about. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep questioning the history you think you know. Catch you next time.
Distorted narratives can warp a civilization's future. Alignments in the sky never lie. Subscribe to step into the next forensic file. See the record corrected.